By August 1945, a staggering 91% of Japanese carrier crew members were dead. Not just casualties, but dead. For every 100 men who served on Japanese carriers, only 9 survived the war. The Imperial Navy began the conflict with 10 fleet carriers and ended with none. This wasn't a military defeat, it was the result of a culture-wide decision to commit suicide by mathematics. Japan began the war with the world's best carrier pilots, each with over 800 hours of flight training. By 1944, new pilots received less than 50 hours. The fatal flaw in Japan's strategy was never rotating experienced pilots home to train new recruits. Instead, every veteran remained in combat until they were killed, and they all were. The Battle of Midway perfectly illustrates this brutal arithmetic. While Japan lost 4 carriers and 322 aircraft, the true blow was the loss of 110 veteran pilots, each with over 2 years of training. Japan could only produce 200 new pilots a month, while the US was generating 2,500. The math was clear. Japan was doomed from the start. Carriers as death traps. Japanese carriers were designed as death traps, a direct result of their damage control doctrine, which was summed up by the phrase, "Offensive spirit overcomes material weakness." They had no formal training in damage control, relying on buckets where American carriers had dedicated firefighting schools. A single torpedo strike on the carrier Taiho resulted in catastrophe. The crew, untrained in damage control, failed to shut off the ventilation, allowing aviation fuel vapors to spread throughout the ship. 6 hours later, a single spark ignited the entire vessel, turning the 27,000-ton carrier into a floating bomb. A survivor from the carrier Shokaku recounted how 3 bombs from American dive bombers were all it took. In just 20 minutes, his ship was gone, and 1,360 men were lost, many burning alive in the flaming water. Another design flaw was the Japanese practice of packing aircraft everywhere, in hangars, on deck, and in passageways. The carrier Akagi, for example, carried 91 planes in a space meant for 60. When a single bomb penetrated a hangar, it didn't just destroy one plane, it triggered a chain reaction that obliterated 20, turning the carriers into floating crematoriums. The most lethal practice, however, was arming and fueling aircraft in enclosed hangars, a process Americans performed on the open deck. When the Kaga was hit by 4 bombs at Midway, 711 men were killed in just 9 minutes, as the hangar deck became a blast furnace of exploding aviation fuel. Adding to these vulnerabilities, Japanese carriers had no radar-directed anti-aircraft guns until 1944, relying on manual aiming against aircraft moving at 400 miles per hour. The hit probability was a mere 2% compared to 18% for American carriers with radar-guided systems. This wasn't combat, it was mathematical suicide. Industrial capacity versus human spirit. Japan lost 4 carriers at Midway and was left with 6. Over the next 2 years, they built 7 more. In the same period, America built 90. Japan launched 1 new carrier in 1944. America launched 19. The Japanese were trying to combat American industrial might with human spirit, and spirit lost. The pilot training situation was even more dire. By 1944, American pilots received 300 hours of training with 100 in operational aircraft. Japanese pilots got only 30 hours, mostly in gliders to save fuel. Many couldn't even land on a carrier in calm seas, let alone under combat conditions. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was not a battle, but an execution. Japan lost 3 carriers and 400 aircraft, but more importantly, 450 pilots. Only 43 were rescued. The US lost 29 aircraft for a kill ratio of 13-1. A captured Japanese naval officer later admitted, "We knew after Midway. We knew we couldn't replace the pilots. Every carrier operation after that was a suicide mission. We just didn't call them that yet." The story of the carrier Shinano, the largest ever built at 72,000 tons, perfectly encapsulates this failure. Sunk on her maiden voyage by 4 torpedoes from a single submarine, she went down because the crew didn't know how to use the damage control equipment or even close watertight doors. By 1945, Japan was so desperate that they were converting battleships and cruise ships into carriers. These were essentially one-way launch platforms for kamikaze attacks. Landing wasn't part of the mission. The final operational Japanese carrier, the Amagi, was destroyed at anchor by U.S. aircraft while its crew waited for pilots and planes that no longer existed. The final and darkest statistic: Japan began the war with 3,500 trained carrier pilots. By its end, only 112 were still alive. The Japanese carrier fleet didn't just lose the war, it committed industrial seppuku, taking 91% of its men with it.